This is the fourth in a series of programs I'm doing on human nature and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, religion, literature, and science have said about it. Why study human nature? Well, so many of the great thinkers claim that in order to better understand ourselves and other people, it's essential that we study human nature. They claim that ignorance of human nature is actually a cause of suffering, and that as we acquire more knowledge about human nature, a greater understanding of human nature, that can actually alleviate our suffering in life. And also, they claim it can help to improve our relationships, that if we have a better understanding of human nature, perhaps our marriages will be better, our friendships might be better, and perhaps we will be better at child raising. Most significantly, if we have a better understanding of human nature, then we are better prepared to live a fulfilling life. If we understand our nature better, then we can understand better what fulfills us in life, what satisfies us in life at a very deep level. So again, the famous thinkers are pretty much in agreement that ignorance of human nature leads to unnecessary suffering, whereby a knowledge of human nature is liberating and can help us to achieve more tranquility and even joy in everyday living. Let me provide a brief review of the first three segments I've done in this series. I raised the question, what are some of the characteristics of human beings? In other words, what characteristics are pretty typical of most, if not all, people? And the characteristics I'm talking about are emotional ones, psychological, mental. And here is a short list of some of the characteristics I've talked about at length. And since this is just a review, I'm just going to enumerate them without much comment. I've pointed out that human beings, it has been said by the great thinkers, by nature are desirous and fearful. Those perhaps are the two chief characteristics of human beings. Again, desirous and fearful. Also, we are complicated creatures. Indeed, Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist, in expressing this idea about how complicated we are, said that it's wrong to attribute some leading characteristic, single leading characteristic to a human being. To say, for example, that someone is wise or unwise, kind or unkind, energetic or lazy. Tolstoy says this is wrong, and he gives his explanation. He says every human being contains the germs of every human quality, displaying all in turn, so that the person you might describe as wise at times acts unwisely. The person you might describe as energetic at times acts in a rather listless, lazy way. In talking about how complicated we are, I also mentioned that Freud and so many other great thinkers have talked about the ambivalence in us. Freud said that it's not unusual that we love and hate the same person. Pascal, the famous French intellectual, talked about the moral ambivalence in human beings. He said, and I'm quoting Pascal, "There are two natures in us, the one good, the other bad." In addition to being desirous, fearful, and complicated, human beings have an inclination to mask wearing. The German philosopher Schopenhauer put it this way, and I'm quoting him, "We all wear a mask and play a role." Charles Dickens, in his famous book, A Tale of Two Cities, says that every human being is constituted to be that profound secret and mystery to every other human being. And the famous psychoanalyst Carl Jung used the word persona to describe the mask or the masks that human beings wear. And he claimed that the persona is a way of impressing other people with certain characteristics that we think might impress them, but also of concealing other characteristics that we might have. So again, the great thinkers claim that another characteristic of human nature is that human beings tend to mask wearing. Also, I pointed out that so many famous thinkers have described human nature and human beings as being aggressive creatures. Indeed, Freud, in his book Civilization and Its Discontents, claimed that human beings are innately aggressive, that we come out of the womb aggressive, and Freud used history, among other things, to try to prove his point. I also mentioned in this context that the famous scientist Carl Sagan, the late Carl Sagan, talked about the reptilian core in human beings. And what is the reptilian core? Well, Dr. Sagan described it this way. He said, the reptilian core is that kernel of savagery in us, left untouched by the process of evolution. Even the Dalai Lama, who so often emphasizes the human capacity for compassion, has said that aggressiveness lives in us at a rather deep level. It must be added that even though we have this propensity for being aggressive creatures, we are nevertheless capable of compassion, of love, of goodness. And finally, another characteristic that I talked about in a previous program is that we human beings suffer. We all experience anxiety, nervousness, unhappiness. But of course, most of us, if not all of us, also experience some happiness, some joy in living. No discussion of human nature would be adequate without asking the question, what role do our genes and the environment play in determining human nature? And what I wish to do now is to give some historical perspective in terms of what thinkers have said over the centuries about this nurture versus nature debate, genes versus environment debate, and then bring it into the 21st century and tell you what famous scientists in recent years have been saying about this debate and what positions they have taken. Again, genes versus environment. Psychologist B.F. Skinner, very famous psychologist who taught at Harvard for many years, in his very famous psychological novel entitled Walden II, which was published in 1948, has one of the characters in the book say the following: men are made, good or bad, and wise or foolish, by the environment in which they live. More than 2,000 years ago, a famous Chinese thinker said something very similar to what psychologist B.F. Skinner said. Mencius, very famous Chinese thinker and a disciple of Confucius, believed that by nature people tend toward goodness. Again, by nature people tend towards goodness. But he added that the adverse circumstances of their environment can erode goodness and engender evil. Mencius believed and said that there is a sense of mercy in all people, a sense of shame in all people, a sense of what is right and wrong in all people. He did concede that these virtues exist in varying degrees in different people. Mencius, in trying to explain the connection between environment and behavior, went on to say this. He said, how can people be good if they are hungry? And if they cannot earn an adequate living, how can they maintain a good heart? How can people maintain a good heart if they cannot earn an adequate living? He suggested that such people might fall prey to all kinds of depravity. And he said this: if the government waits until these people have lapsed into crime to punish them, then it's as if the government has set traps for these people by not making a serious effort to improve their environment. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, very famous French thinker of the 18th century, shared Mencius' idea that it is basically the environment that determines whether human beings are good or bad, Rousseau claimed that human nature is not evil. He said whatever evil people do is generally a product of the corruption and the constraints of society. Rousseau had the idea that so often it is society that corrupts people. So again, in the last few minutes, I've pointed out that famous thinkers such as psychologist B.F. Skinner, Chinese philosopher Mencius, and French intellectual Rousseau all claimed that human beings by nature are good, and it is the environment ultimately that determines how they will ultimately behave. In contrast to these three thinkers, and there are many other thinkers, by the way, in their camp, so to speak, but in contrast to them is St. Augustine, very, very famous Catholic thinker and Catholic saint. St. Augustine emphasized nature. St. Augustine said that we are not by nature good. He said we have to work at being good. Why so? Well, St. Augustine believed we are all tainted by Adam and Eve's sin. And because of Adam and Eve's sin, we bear the stain of original sin. That sin, their sin, changed things dramatically. So again, by nature, we are not good. If we're going to be good, we have to work at it. Indeed, St. Augustine, in his autobiography, a very famous autobiography, which I encourage you to read, some of you perhaps have already read it, it's entitled The Confessions of St. Augustine. In his autobiography, St. Augustine talks about his youth and some of the wild things he did. And he points out that he and his friends would sometimes steal pears from a neighbor's pear tree. And he said there was no need to steal them, that he could have gotten pears elsewhere without committing a crime and without even paying for them. Well, why then did he and his friends steal pears? He said it was the thrill of it, the thrill of doing evil. And St. Augustine believed that this is not unusual among human beings, that perhaps one element of human nature is that people can find it thrilling to do evil, and hence his idea that we have to work at being good. 19th century British philosopher Herbert Spencer is in the Augustine camp, although the specifics of his approach to human nature do differ from St. Augustine's. But I say he's in Augustine's camp, so to speak, because philosopher Herbert Spencer also believed that it's basically it's basically our genes. It's basically our genes that determine our behavior. Herbert Spencer has been referred to as a social Darwinist, and they believe that the genes have greater influence over how we behave than does our environment. Spencer, in giving an example of this, claimed that usually highly successful people are genetically superior to other people. Again, highly successful people, according to Spencer, are generally genetically superior to other people. In the 19th century, some Protestant ministers, even in the United States, pursued Spencer's thinking and gave it some credibility. Some Protestant ministers claimed there was a connection between great wealth and virtue. They claimed that usually rich people were very virtuous people, and that if one wanted to be wealthy, the path to wealth, at least in part, was to be a good human being. Well, now for the $64 question. What has science in recent years said about the role of genes versus the environment in determining human nature? I must tell you, there is disagreement. And perhaps two Harvard professors best frame the debate. Biologist E.O. Wilson comes down on the side of genes, and the late Stephen Jay Gould, very famous Harvard professor of zoology, came down on the side of environment. Let me give you some of the specifics of their approaches, and also some ideas from some other thinkers in each man's camp, so to speak. As I mentioned, Edward O. Wilson is a very famous professor of biology, professor of biology at Harvard. And Professor Wilson has written the following: "The essence of human nature is sketched out by the genes. The essence of human nature is sketched out by the genes." He goes on to say this: human behaviors are governed by epigenetic rules. That's his phrase, epigenetic rules. He coined that phrase. And what does he mean by that? Well, epigenetic rules consist of genetically based neural wiring that predispose the brain to favor certain actions over other actions. Again, he believes we are wired, in part, to favor certain actions over other actions. And this wiring is gene-connected, so to speak. Among the behaviors that Professor Wilson believes are shaped in some way or another by our genes are the following: altruism, patriotism, status seeking, territorial expansion. Again, Professor Wilson believes that our biology predisposes us to these behaviors. Professor Wilson confirms our complexity. On the one hand, he says that our biology promotes altruism in us, the idea of helping other people. But he also claims, on the other hand, that we are wired by our genes to status seeking and territorial expansion. In other words, competing with other people for superiority. What Professor Wilson, I think, is saying in so many words is what so many other thinkers have said, and that is that we human beings are so complicated that we may have an instinct for compassion as well as an instinct for aggression. Although I think Professor Wilson would prefer phrasing it this way, that we are wired for compassion and we are also wired for aggression. Professor Wilson, in summary, has said again that our behaviors are genetically shaped. And again, here are his own words as I summarize his view. Professor Wilson has said, "The search for human nature can be viewed as the archaeology of the epigenetic rules." Professor Steven Pinker of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology is also in Professor Wilson's camp. He tends to emphasize genes more than environment as the ultimate shaper of human behavior. Professor Pinker says that man, by nature, is not a noble savage, that people, by nature, are not mild, pacific, and unacquisitive. And Professor Pinker enumerates some of the behaviors that he believes are innate social behaviors. In other words, behaviors that in some way or another we are wired to perform. He says, for example, that in us there is a drive for dominance and a willingness to use violence to attain goals. This sounds a lot like psychiatrist Alfred Adler, who many, many years ago said that the goal of superiority, of the conquest of others, of power over others, is the goal which motivates most human beings. Again, Professor Pinker claims we are wired to want dominance over others, and again, we have a willingness to use violence to achieve our goals. Professor Pinker also claims that ethnocentrism and other forms of group against group hostility are a product of our genes. He claims, for example, it is not difficult in society to arouse group against group hostility. Perhaps what's going on in Iraq now the conflict between the Shiite Muslims and the Sunni Muslims might be an example of this, as well as the problems Northern Ireland has had for such a long time. Roman Catholics, yes, and Protestant Christians in an ongoing battle. Fortunately, in recent years, there's been some waning in the violence on both sides, but nevertheless, it did last a long time, and the problem has not been completely solved. Professor Pinker says that besides the idea that our genes wire us for ethnocentrism and group against group hostility, that also it makes it easy, he says human beings are easily aroused to racial hatred. Human beings, because of our genetic disposition, according to Professor Pinker, are easily aroused to racial hatred. Professor Pinker goes on to say that political systems must take into account human nature, and that if political systems, if governments, if constitutions are going to be good ones, are going to be successful, that they must mobilize some aspects of human nature to rein in other aspects of human nature. And Professor Pinker has praise for the U.S. Constitution and some general praise for the U.S. government. The idea is he believes that our Constitution does do a lot to mobilize some aspects of human nature, positive aspects of human nature, to try to rein in some of the negative aspects of human nature. And I suspect one of the things he's alluding to is the separation of powers in our federal government between the executive, legislative, and judicial, and also our system of checks and balances designed to prevent anybody in our government from accruing too much power. Professor Pinker, in concluding, says this: he sees human nature as largely inscribed by our genes. Again, he sees human nature as largely inscribed by indelible genes. Indelible genes. An important question is the following: is the mind initially blank at birth and only scribbled on after birth by experiences? Or does the mind at birth contain lessons already written by ancient genes? And another equally important question: with any given trait, how much can be attributed to genes? How much can be attributed to environment? As I've pointed out, Professors Wilson and Pinker emphasize genes. Well, let me give you a different viewpoint now. Stephen Jay Gould, the late Stephen Jay Gould, taught zoology at Harvard for many years and died about 2 years ago. And shortly before his death, he said this. He said, "The most recent research on the human genome may liberate us from the harmful and false idea that every aspect of our being, either physical or behavioral, can be ascribed to a particular gene for the trait in question." He went on to say this: the task of explaining human behavior will be much harder than reductionist science imagines. His phrase, reductionist science, was a not so subtle attack on the likes of Professor Wilson and Professor Pinker. Gould claims they are simplifying what in fact is a very complicated thing, human behavior. Gould, in explaining his viewpoint, went on to say this. He talked about Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address. You might recall in that address, Lincoln, during the Civil War, called on the nation to heal its wounds by marshaling the better angels of our nature. That was Lincoln's expression, the better angels of our nature. Professor Gould says he subscribes to this idea. There is something such as the better angels of our nature. But he goes on to say, and I'm quoting him now, "You will not find the better angels of our nature resident within, say, gene 26, on chromosome 12. Arthur Caplan is also another famous contemporary thinker who agrees with Professor Gould that environment plays a more significant role than genes in shaping our behavior. Dr. Caplan, by the way, is the director of the Center for Bioethics at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. And he says this, and I'm quoting Professor Caplan, "Our genes are not the defining essence of who we are. Genes can produce a wide array of outcomes depending on the environment in which they are activated." He then goes on to say, and I'm quoting Professor Caplan, "Human nature is not written simply in our genome." Well, who's got it right? Professors Wilson and Pinker, who emphasize genes, or Professors Gould and Caplan, who emphasize environment? And of course, there are other professors in both camps. Well, I think Erica Gould, a science writer, writing in the Science Times, helps provide some illumination on, again, who's right, who's wrong. She says this, and I'm quoting Erica Gould. "The nature-nurture dichotomy is in many ways false." She goes on to say that both sides agree that both genes and environment play an important role in shaping our behavior. She says the significant question is this, that of the relative balance of environment and genes in determining how humans behave. And of course, as of this moment, there's no definitive evidence as to what the balance is, as to how much genes influence our behavior and how much environment influences our behavior. I see I'm running short on time. I will continue this discussion about nurture versus nature next week, as well as some other elements of human nature. But now I'd like to close, as I usually do, with a quotation from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau in Walden penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."